Welcome back to what is the final session of our special eConference, coming to you from the Broken Bay Institute in Sydney, Australia, and of course being seen in, as far as we know, some 14 countries around the world, but perhaps even more that may have joined us during the live presentation. Thank you for the questions that you have sent in, and we are about to begin the process of answering them. I'm happy to say that we have all four of our contributors lined up to do exactly that. From the United States, we have online Professor Amy Jill Levine. We have here, of course, Professor Imam Mohammed Abdallah, also Professor Emeritus Professor Terry Lovett, and the Reverend Dorothy Lee as well. So welcome to each and every one of them, and of course thank you for the questions that you have put to us. I wonder if first up we could establish the connection, of course, with Professor Levine by asking her a question we've received. Isn't the problem of religious violence the extremist elements? No matter how peaceful you interpret a text, an extremist will always interpret it in one very particular and often violent way. That's why we call it extremist. That question from Gabriel Gomez. Professor Levine.
It's a very fair question. On the other hand, we have extremists who interpret their texts toward extreme peace, toward extreme love, and toward extreme compassion. So the issue is not the extremity per se, it's the direction in which that extremity goes. Regardless of how problematic the interpretation is, my general sense is to try to remain in communication with such individuals rather than to bracket them off or write them off or demonize them, and hope that in attempting to show them that the text they claim to be sacred does actually have other messages, one might be able to temper some of that negative extremism.
Thank you for that. What about the panellists that we have with us in this presentation? Would someone like to add perhaps a little to what's been said on that line?
I think one of the problems is that people interpreting texts take individual verses and run with them rather than reading the whole text, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the Quran or the New Testament, whatever. They just take a few texts that happen to fit their particular ideology and run with them, regardless of the kind of the tendency, if you could call it that, of the text itself, of the whole text, and not to mention the important commentators on it. So I think that kind of proof texting is extremely dangerous.
Is part of that problem, if I could come to the professor from the School of Humanities at Griffith University, is part of that problem obviously inbred in terms of those who look from the outside at the Muslim faith and perhaps those within the Muslim faith, or some of them, looking the same way back to those who are not of that faith?
Well, yes, certainly. I think, just coming back to the point of extremism, I think it's must be noted that extremism is an aberration usually in religious traditions, and certainly that is the case from the Islamic tradition. And it is not only because of a single faceted reason, not because of one factor. As often you'll find multi-faceted reasons for why people become extremists. Sometimes it is because of a decontextualization of the text, or sometimes because that is coupled with other socio-economic political factors that may lead people to become extremists because perhaps they may feel sometimes marginalized, excluded, or perhaps unjustly treated. And so then they may utilize text to justify their actions that may, in their essence, be illegitimate from a religious point of view.
Perhaps one way around all of that is obviously trying to create peace, which is really what today's discussion has all been about. If I could come to Professor Lovett then, let's go back to the Convivencia period. What brought an end to that period? A question from Nancy Hooper.
Pretty clearly the exclusivist trigger being pulled. I mean, it was being undermined for a long time by some Muslims themselves who didn't like the idea of these Jews and Christians being treated so well, by elements of the Jewish community that wanted to hark back to, something they thought was back there that they'd lost. And certainly by the Christians, one has to say, by the Christian wars, conquistador, etc., in Spain.
A question perhaps building from that has come from John O'Malley in New Zealand, and this also takes us back to the professor next to you. He says, peace to Muslims is peace on their terms and not any other creed. To what extent was convivencia governed by Sharia law or Sharia law?
That's a very, very good question, and I'm assuming that the question has been asked because the assumption is that if Sharia law was dominant, therefore convivencia would not have existed. And of course, that is not true. Sharia law was very much alive in Spain during the convivencia. And in fact, Sharia law only stopped being applied in Muslim countries post the colonial experience. And so often people in the West misunderstand Sharia because they take a single aspect of Sharia law and decide that it is totally barbaric or it's backward. What they fail to see is that there are higher objectives of Sharia. For instance, the 5 primary objectives of Sharia are the preservation of life, faith, intellect, progeny, and wealth or economy. And these are very much consistent, if you like, with any higher objectives of any religious teachings, including democracy. And so Sharia law in its higher objectives is not incompatible with the higher objectives of democracy. And in fact, it is the absence of the application of the higher objectives of Sharia that leads to the creation of groups like ISIS, who are intolerant towards other people and other religious groups, including Muslims themselves. And hence, convivencia survived because there were groups of Muslims and leaders who were applying the higher objectives of Sharia law. When that diminished, convivencia also diminished.
What about Professor Lovett? A further comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It, as I tried to say in my talk, it was largely because of an Islamic theology that was shared by the other faiths that convivencia was made possible. Islam is the religion that has the theology for the other two. It's the importance of Islam then, it's the importance now. And there's no question that Sharia is absolutely central to that. Sharia is a concept that's been trashed, not least in our own time. Education about it is extremely poor. It's done by the media, essentially. We've got to get over that, or we just continue to perpetuate negative stereotypes that do us no good.
A question for Professor Lee. Is it forgiveness that connects peacemaking with justice-making, or is it some other attribute that connects peacemaking and justice-making together?
I'm not sure I was trying to say that forgiveness necessarily connects them. I was just saying that the 3 aspects of peacemaking are love of enemy and forgiveness, that they belong together. As I said in my talk, I don't think it's the only aspect. I think we need to talk about justice, and I think we need to talk about protection of the weak alongside the love of peace. I think forgiveness is integral to Christian faith. I mean, we learnt it from Judaism. It's also central to Islam. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a connecting point, but it's an essential aspect. If we believe in conversion, in transformation, then we need to learn to forgive one another, to be forgiven and to forgive.
In some ways, it would seem that that question embodies a lot of what we're trying to talk about today in the way that we've looked at these Abrahamic traditions and how they relate to whether in fact we're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction in terms of religion. So if I could just put that generally to any of our other panellists, perhaps Professor Levine, if you would like to make a comment on that.
I've been thinking about this conversation regarding forgiveness, and it disturbs me to some extent. There's a great deal of pressure put on people, particularly within the Christian tradition, to forgive. And at times, forgiveness may not be warranted, it may not be safe, and it may not be appropriate. I think it's sinful to say to somebody who's just been raped, you must forgive your rapist. I think it's inappropriate to have forgiveness from a third party. If someone sins against my daughter, I do not have the authority to forgive. If someone kills my people, I don't have the authority to forgive. So I'm actually much less interested in forgiveness than I am in détente. I think that's much more achievable. And I don't think that people need to forgive in order to be themselves whole. I have a former graduate student named Maria Mayo Robbins, who wrote a dissertation, and she began by asking why in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them," rather than forgiving himself. And she argues that there are some times when forgiveness might be part of God's prerogative, but perhaps not part of ours.
I would agree with that. I think the situation of, a woman who's been raped, expected to forgive her rapist, is an act of injustice against her. However, I still think forgiveness is important, but it has to go along with justice. And I think that in the end, I think people do need to learn to forgive in order to escape any bitterness of heart. But only if there is justice done. I don't see how you can forgive if someone gets off scot-free with a gross act of injustice and violence such as rape.
Any other comment?
I'll stick up for forgiveness. I think without forgiveness nothing gets healed, and yeah, of course we need justice, and there's all sorts of limits we'd want to put on it. What about this situation? What about that situation? But the bottom line is, without forgiveness, nothing heals, nothing ever gets better. And I think of the reconciliation trials in South Africa, where Mandela was pushed and pushed and pushed. Nelson, not this group, surely not this group. You can't forgive. This is what they did. No. If we don't forgive, if we don't reconcile with everybody, there is no reconciliation. And indeed, I think of what's just happened in Charleston, that tragic event, the power of those people turning up at that church a few days after losing loved ones and saying, "We forgive you." There's a power there that nothing else has. And it's so absent in the world that we live in today.
A question perhaps flowing on from that, from one of our correspondents, noting that what we've done today is an important step forward from the point of view of the exchange of ideas and other people being able to see it. How do we help people accept the Abrahamic God when a correspondent says, "In my childhood we had little relationships with Protestant religions and with Jews"? She doesn't say precisely where she's coming from, but I suspect it's possibly a Catholic question.
Well, I would say little chance. I mean, the greatness of convivencia was that people were pushed onto each other and had to either, fight it out or learn to live for the good of the whole, as Muhammad said. And they learned a formula, and they had a theology that allowed them to do that. But if people have come out of a very small world, then their God is going to be, in all likelihood, a small God. And I would think that most of us, who certainly my age in Australia, grew up with a very small God, who, in my case, didn't have any time for Protestants, much less Jews and Muslims. I've grown to appreciate what a small world I grew up in, and I don't think the God that I learnt about then was any more than a shadow of God.
How much more difficult then, if we're building on what I guess is inherent in that sort of question, what we've talked about today, how much more difficult is it if in fact the general consensus of opinion within, say, one stream of society is negative in terms about those who are of a particular other stream? If I could put that to Professor Abdallah, in other words, the perception that a lot of people may well have against Muslims within the other side of the community involving the religions we've been talking about today. How much more difficult does that make it to try to get across that message of peace when in fact there's an inherent distrust, unfortunately, in the minds of too many people?
Well, it makes it extremely difficult, and that's why the onus of proof, the responsibility, is upon all of our shoulders. And I feel religious leaders can play a massive role, but also we need to have positive and responsible leadership at the political level, and also responsible journalism so that it can allow for this type of engagement and discourse to take place, people will continue to fear the other. And in this particular case, there is a tremendous amount of fear nowadays towards Islam and Muslims, unfortunately, because of local and international events. And in doing so, we end up demonizing the entire Muslim community. There's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. It's a very small fraction that are committing atrocities in the name of Islam, unfortunately. But the entire community gets tainted with the same brush, and that is not only unfortunate, but it continues to perpetrate the problem itself, and marginalizes young people. It makes them feel not belong to this country or the country in which they live. They begin to feel that they may need to find a sense of identity elsewhere and become more vulnerable and may fall in the lap or the laps of radical groups. And so, and it links to the previous question, I think in our own churches, in our own synagogues, in our own mosques, we need to talk about the God of the Abrahamic God. We need to talk about being inclusive. We need to remind our congregation about the convivencia and about the shared values that we all have. But also collectively, we should be able to exert some pressure onto our politicians and perhaps media outlets to begin the positive discourse about the shared values we all have.
On to the role. Yes, sorry,
I
Professor
just wanted
Lee.
to say something about that, because I entirely agree with what Mohammed is saying, particularly in this country. But if you ask me, it's a deeper problem, and that is the kind of aggressive kind of secularism that goes on in our culture. And it particularly at the moment is being aimed at Muslim people, but it's also aimed at Jews and Christians as well in this country. It just doesn't happen to be in the spotlight in quite the same way at the moment. But the kind of misunderstanding that I as a Christian experience from the media is just quite extraordinary. And I know my Jewish friends also find the same thing. There's a very aggressive secularization that says that any institutional religion is wrong and bad. And if we got rid of institutional religion, we'd solve the problem. But in actual fact, there's a very good case to be made that our three religions, that our three faiths have brought absolutely wonderful values to our society that still in many ways undergird our societies. So the consequence of that is that I think, A, we need to get to know each other better. We need to be in dialogue with each other and not sort of allowed to go into our little silos of our own faith or our own religious group. We need to be in dialogue with people of other faiths. Personal relationships, to me, is at the heart of this. And secondly, I think we need to learn to disagree, because we don't agree on everything. We're not just one form, of the same religion. We've got lots in common, but there are fundamental places where we disagree. And we should be allowed to do that, and to do that in charity, and to disagree in the strongest terms, and yet still love and respect each other, and still be able to learn from each other.
Professor Levine, do you see things the same way, given the fact that your perspective is a little different to those within this room from one particular country?
Well, I've spent enough time in Australia to be able to say amen to everything that I've heard so far. The forces of secularization are prominent here as well, and they are equally pernicious and they're equally narrow. As we've already noted, religion can be an extraordinary source for the good. It can also be a catalyst for evil. So can secularization, so can atheism, so can any ism that we've got. So this incessant putting on of labels and condemning whole cloth without actually recognizing the group from within is unhelpful. One way of getting along better and fostering understanding is to be able to understand a movement in the words of the people who practice it. So rather than my saying, here's what Christians think or here's what Muslims think, I need to be able to express a view such that my Christian friends and my Muslim friends would say, yeah, that's right. That's how I perceive myself. And the second point is that when we look at a tradition other than our own, I think it's our responsibility to begin with the best of that tradition rather than the aberrant worst.
A question which I think is relevant to both Professor Levine and also Professor Lee. The question is, what is the role of women in the peace process? Now, could I just sort of interpose on that and say, what is the special role for women in the peace process? Because I think we are talking generally about this question of peace at the moment. So is there a special role for women? They often say that wars don't start if women are prime ministers or whatever, but I think that's been given the lie in recent years,
Yes,
if
thinking
not
of
before.
the whole history of warrior women, a book that I read not so long ago, I wouldn't necessarily want to argue that. Women have a place in everything, you know, that we have a voice and we have a perspective that we bring to everything. I don't want to get into sort of stereotyping that says that women are more gentle and sort of meek, and therefore we bring this lovely, life-loving perspective. I mean, it would be nice if it was true, but sadly I think it isn't. But I think we need to have women's voices as well as men's voices in this debate, all the way through at every level of peace and of the life of our institutions.
I suppose the stereotype for a bad Saturday night is a couple of men getting into a fight but not women. So I suppose that may sort of trigger the idea that perhaps women are more peace conscious than perhaps men are due to testosterone or some other factor.
And any sort of this biological or genetic determinism that suggests that women are more peaceful, women are more compassionate, I don't think that's helpful. I think it simply ratchets us into particular stereotypes. We have less upper body strength than men. We're not as good in the infantry generally as men are. But can we fight? Yes. Can we speak hatred and venom? Absolutely, and
Yes.
we've done it. It is the who perceive themselves to have been silenced by whatever authority system they are under, and who find themselves to have words of peace but have not yet spoken them. It is our responsibility to get up and say something. And if we're ignored because we're women, then we just speak all the louder and gather more colleagues to voice that chorus along with us.
Mm.
Many of the questions that we've received today have, of course, talked about that issue of peace, which is right at the heart of our discussion. But let's move on, if you like, to consideration of God, perhaps in various forms. Letting God requires a large and vast heart and mind, says one of our questioners. In fact, a number of our questioners have taken this line. How can we instill this vastness into people's minds? Professor Lovett, perhaps we start with you.
I guess the short answer is through education, not just school education, but the way that parents speak to their children about God, and just finding the right moment to start that very sophisticated talk and not spoiling it too early and all of those sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that what's gone wrong, if I can put it that way, is that too many parts of the world have grown up with what I'd call a narrow conception of God. A God who the secularists then can easily take over, because who needs that sort of God in the kind of world that we live in today? I think any tradition, I mean, I was listening before to the talk about extremism and terrorism, that's a problem, and we've got to address that in whatever way we can. I actually don't think it's the biggest problem. It's certainly not the most ingrained problem. I think the most ingrained problem is that we have, frankly, too many religious believers of one sort or another who think that they've got God pinned. They've got God in a box, and he's mine or he's ours and he's not yours, and maybe he's sort of yours, yes, because he's a loving God, and so we'll let a little bit of God out to you. No, I think we have to be challenged to think whether we really have ever pinned down the God of the universe, the God who is ineffable, the God who the mystics tell us is always beyond our reach. And if that God that we think we have has led us into a pattern of behaviour that is violent, that is oppressive, then again I want to ask the question, is that the God you really want to follow? Is that really God? And if you do, why bother? Because you can be violent and oppressive without any God.
Exactly. It's a very broad question, that. Any further contributions along that line?
It is a broad question. From the Islamic perspective, when we speak of God, we think of attributes of beauty and attributes of majesty. and often his attributes of beauty are far outweigh the attributes of majesty. So attributes of beauty such as he's the most compassionate, the most merciful, the loving, and so forth. And interestingly, in the classical Islamic period, the emphasis was always to teach the children the attributes of beauty, the vastness of God, and his being a universal God, and not to affiliate God with any gender or with any ethnicity or with any color or with any group or any race or any language. And that is why in the Arabic language, and I assume perhaps in the Hebrew also, given that the sister languages, the word Allah does not denote a God that has a certain physical appearance, nor does he have a certain affinity with any cultural group or ethnicity. And so he's always being referred to as Rabbul Alameen, the Lord of the worlds, for instance. So in the mind of the listener, he or she are being taught from at a young age that you are not dealing with a God that is concerned only with a small group of people, but he is the creator of the universe and everything that is in it. And I think it's a responsibility, therefore, upon us to teach that to our children and also in our own places of worship. I keep saying that religious leaders play a vital role to introduce this idea and continue to emphasize the fact that the Lord of this universe is far beyond and greater than the small God that Professor Terry keeps talking about. And so it's a process of education, but also more importantly, in my estimation, we have to embody these teachings. We have to become a living example for our own children, our own constituency, so that they can see that the God that we speak about is the God that is being represented through our own actions and manifestations.
A question, again, I suppose directed to you. Is peace and love prominent as values in the Muslim community?
Of course it is. It's like with any other community. In fact, the words that are often repeated in the Islamic community is Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Day and night we repeat this greeting. And again, if you look at the tradition, in the classical tradition, if a person said to you, Assalamu alaikum, may the peace of God be upon you, automatically they must be given an assurity of peace, even if they were an enemy. The minute they say Assalamu alaikum, that is a guarantee of peace, a guarantee of safety for this particular person. Muslims, like any other community, we have the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And so there are people who will promote peace day and night, and will speak about it day and night. And there are people who will be utilizing the text to advocate their own political, religious convictions or ulterior motives, and therefore make peace a secondary or, if at all, an option. But of course, 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, they are like anybody else, want peace, they love peace, and they promote peace in their lives, in their sermons, when they talk with their kids, when they talk with their neighbors. The month of Ramadan that we are in now, the month of fasting, is about, in fact, disciplining the soul so that one becomes at peace with oneself, with one's creator, and with one's neighbors and the world that is with him. Unfortunately, however, there are various socio-economic political reasons that can sometimes push people to become more extreme, if you wish, and in doing so give a bad name to everybody else in this regard.
That, I suppose, is really the core of some of the problems that have been there from time immemorial, not specifically related to your religion as such, but again, there are people sitting on the other side of the fence, on one side or another, who will obviously choose to see the fact that one particular element of a society is a negative, and in this case, I suppose, dealing with the contemporary situation, a lot of other people are seeing that against the Muslim community.
I mean, absolutely. If you look at Islam in Australia, most people don't know that Islam and Muslims have been here for a long time. And I always say, if Islam is inherently the problem, then Muslims should have exhibited this problem years ago. And so most people are aware that first Muslims to come to Australia were the Cameleers in the 1800s. But in fact, Islam's presence predates the Cameleers, 1650, when the Macassans came from Indonesia. And now they have found some coins in Darwin. They found these coins in the 1940s. It's only now recently that they are investigating the origin of these coins, and they found Arabic writings on these coins, which indicates that these coins were at least 1,000 years old, that came from some part of North Africa, from a particular Islamic sultanate. And so there might be some connection that Islam and Muslims have visited Australia even 1,000 years ago. If you look at the relationship between Muslims and the indigenous community in the 1650s and later, it was a positive relationship. And if Islam is inherently violent and is inherently problematic, then Muslims who came here in the early period would have displayed this type of violence. But this violence only has unfortunately been manifested in the last decade and a half or so, and it is because of international events and also other local events that one must consider if we are to seriously find genuine solutions to this problem.
Any other comment on that angle, Professor Lovett?
I tend to think it's a human disposition to like difference, to like feeling that we've got something you don't have, be it a football team or a car, or and I function in an academic world where two academics never agree, you know, even if they look like they're in the same field. Least of all people in my area of philosophy and theology. Philosophy and theology conferences tend to be, you know, pretty violent in their own way, in the way people go about dealing with each other. So I think it's a human disposition, and I suppose this is what I referred to before as, you know, metaphorically a kind of a Satan that's in us. You know, we are of a fallen nature. I believe that, and we do have a disposition towards evil. We're more easily disposed to be narrow than to be broad, to be unforgiving than forgiving, etc., etc. And then you throw religion into that mix. You throw a God and a sacred text and a whole lot of sacred stories. It can endorse that narrowness. It's not meant to. You know, religion, we'd say, it's a great binding force. It's meant to push us out of our little narrow worlds. But it definitely has the capacity, not just on an extremist end, but for a rump in the middle, and particularly institutional leadership, to use the sacredness, the sacred artefacts, to actually endorse what is a natural disposition to be narrow, to be small, to retreat, in a sense, rather than engage.
I'm not sure I see it quite so negatively. I understand what you're saying, Terry, but I'm not quite. I think I'm a bit more sanguine about the good that religion has done, including Christian faith as well as Judaism and Islam. I think we've done tremendous good and are continuing to. And yes, of course, there may be that rump, and it may be that some of the leadership is conservative. I'm in a church that's just decided at its synod on the weekend to incorporate so that it now can be sued by victims of sexual abuse. Now, I mean, I'm very proud of my church for doing that and that decision that it's made. And I think there are, when I look at some of the things that the Pope is saying at the moment, for example, most recently on climate change, I think tremendous good is being done. And I'm speaking Christianity now, but I could easily give examples from Judaism and Islam that we actually are a force for good, essentially. And there are bad apples, there are rotten apples, and they get, my goodness, they get media coverage too. But the endless priests, for example, in some of these religious orders, who have done countless good over countless generations, is never mentioned. And so I think we need to be careful not to be bad-mouthing ourselves, not to be putting ourselves down, but because we can take a pride, not in our own achievements, but what God has done through us, sometimes in spite of us, absolutely, but what God has done through us. There has been a real light that has been shone in the world through our Abrahamic traditions, and I think we need to affirm that as well.
Yeah, I obviously didn't express it well. I'm with you 100% on what you just said. I guess what I was trying to say was, I don't think religion is the problem.
Yes.
Humanity, if you like,
Yes.
is the problem.
Human nature.
And religion is just one of any number of isms that can give people
Yes.
a huge license to oppress, to be violent. Communism and socialism and any number of Nazism, you know, guilty of at least as much, if not more, than any of the religious isms. But I think where there is a God, that's my continual challenge is, for those who believe in a God, yeah, make sure that God really is leading you the right way, the right behaviour.
On the subject of questions, we did invite our live audience to perhaps contribute if anyone would like to do that at this time. Please come forward and use this microphone. Thank you.
Just a question for the panel. In history, the pursuit of converts has often led, unfortunately, to violence. And in interfaith dialogue as it occurs in Australia today, an article of respect is that we don't seek the other person to change their faith. Can you imagine a world where Christianity and Islam both acknowledged that there is no need to ask someone else to change their faith?
Do we have a comment?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we're all engaged in the pursuit of truth. And it may be that truth will lead us from one faith to another. It may be. It may be that if I talk for long enough, I may change religions. And I don't think we should discourage people because we do believe that there is truth. And frankly, we believe that there's probably more truth in our own faith than there is in others. Now, I mean, you know, that is a fact. There are people Jewish people do not see Jesus in the same way as we do, as the Son of God, don't believe in the Trinity. Now, I might become convinced at some point in my life, I'll lose my job if I do, that you know, the Trinity is in fact a real attack on monotheism. And then I'm going to have to change religions. So I have no problem with people. I have problems with sheep stealing. I have problems with actually going out and actively telling people their religion is false, and you have to come to us because we alone will give you salvation. But I don't think there's anything wrong with encouraging the pursuit of truth, encouraging dialogue, and people will change their religions, and that's not a problem for me. I mean, I'd rather not lose too many from my religion, but you know, that's just a personal thing.
Yeah. It is an interesting question, and I don't see it possible that there would be a situation where either of these two religions would stop proselytizing and wishing others to convert. And so, to be quite realistic from the Islamic perspective, the idea of trying to convince others that Islam is the way forward will remain there. I don't think, therefore, there is a problem with the idea of converting, but the process and the way of doing it is problematic, or can be problematic. So therefore, forceful conversion, for instance, whether by the sword or even through people's vulnerabilities. So sometimes if people are vulnerable and we try to use their vulnerability to convert them to our faith tradition, then from a pure technical Sharia perspective, that is not allowed. Or of course, although historically there has been cases of forceful conversion, but that is deemed as invalid and inappropriate, because conversion should come from one's heart. One is convinced about a particular perspective, and therefore they wish to convert to that perspective. And because that, in terms of converting to Islam in this case, or religion, then it is, you're doing it for the sake of God Himself and not for other factors. For if you do it for other factors, then that conversion in itself is seen as invalid from, again, a Sharia point of view. And importantly, if, and as happens in some cases of poorer nations, for instance, where we use people's vulnerabilities of being poor or oppressed and so forth, and then use these vulnerabilities to convert them, that is seen as problematic from an Islamic point of view. And so essentially the dialogue before conversion should be where you inform the person, and a person therefore converts because he or she are well informed and make that choice voluntarily and because they are convinced. If somebody reaches that conclusion, then I don't see a problem with that.
Can I add to this? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Two things. First, St. Francis of Assisi said one should proclaim the gospel always, but use words only when necessary. So that the best form of any type of proselytism is to show by one's deeds what one believes rather than to proclaim with one's mouth a particular theological doctrine. If anything were to convince me to convert to Christianity, it would have been either my friends, the Maryknolls on City, Manila, or the Sisters of Zion in Box Hill in Melbourne. The other thing is that religion is not something into which one can be argued. So I find the incessant proof texting of people, let me show you from my text why I'm right and you're wrong, to be a form of category confusion. Religion is, as we've just heard, a matter of the heart. It is much like love, and love has nothing to do with logic. So to presume that we can make a logical argument about why our religion is better or why any religion is better is simply to confuse logic and love.
Professor Levine, while you're there, if I could just go back to that question that we tried to put to you a moment ago. I don't know how much of it you got, but the initial part was about satanic claims dividing us from your talk. And then finally, how do we bring people into conversation so that they are not required to sacrifice the particulars of their own tradition, even when it comes to how they understand the divinity as you see it in terms of the three traditions?
I think that's exactly the way one begins, is one does not come to an interfaith conversation by seeding everything that's important to us. When we enter that conversation, it helps to have some sense of who we are, to know what is important for our own self-definition, what is important for how our community defines us, and whether we disagree with the communal consensus, because we might do that as well. So that in that conversation, we begin to learn more clearly what in fact are the non-negotiables. Religion should never be watered down to a lowest common denominator, which is why I get very nervous when I hear about things like the God of Abraham in whom we all believe, or the one God who rules over all of us. We can make those claims, but where we really get traction is to figure out where we differ on those claims, and yet how, even though we differ, we can still work together because the goals are the same, the goals being peace and justice.
Thank you. Any comment from back here on that?
If I could just answer the question before about Christianity and Islam in particular. I think Christianity and Islam, while the two most guilty religions in terms of converting by force, actually have great synergies that have largely been untested. And we see some of those in the convivencia states, all the way through to mild forms of combined worship, etc., etc. But I spent some time in a Tanzanian family, a blended Christian-Muslim family, and there's lots of them in that part of Africa. And it fascinated me how easily they were devout, but respectful, and they were one family. And a lot of it, in that case, came down to the common Jesus stories, the common Mary stories, and all the way back through the tradition. They made use of those common stories that are there to be made use of. And again, from an educational point of view and a theological point of view, I think in the world today we make such little use of it. I mean, you've only got to look at the Australian school system, the Australian university system. You could walk through almost any of our universities from one side to the other, and you wouldn't hear these vital things even being talked about.
Thank you, Professor Lovett. We have another question live here in our studio, so I'll pass it over. Thank you.
I'm prompted by the talk of a small God or a big God. And I remember an incident that happened to me, it's about 20 years ago. I was sitting with a colleague of mine, Sean McDonough, who's an ecological theologian, and we were in the Philippines, and we were sitting in Baguio in the mountains of Luzon, and we're looking down on the plains of Zambales. And Sean said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, they say they should beat their swords into ploughshares. And he said, the ploughshare's done much more harm than a sword ever has done. is there not some truth in that maybe the big question is not war, but ecological question?
Maybe that takes us back to the papal encyclical that was referred to just a moment ago there by Professor Lee. Any comment from the panel on that?
Oh, look, I would entirely agree that ecology is a huge issue of climate change. I wouldn't say that it's the only issue, but it certainly is a huge issue confronting us, and one that our faith, despite the differences, we do believe in a creator God who not only created the world but who sustains it at every point, and therefore we ought to be at the forefront, I think, of responsible stewardship of creation. And I think there's no question in my mind, but I don't think that's an either or with questions of war and peace. They go along together. We need to be responsible, loving, peacemaking, not just with one another and not just across our faiths, but also with the creation itself, which we have despoiled and continue to despoil over against, I think, God's command.
I suppose if you think of climate change and everything associated with it as one of those things that really should bring us together from the point of view of just maintaining our human home, even that is an area that unfortunately we have a lot of disagreement on, and that's not religiously based. It's based by a whole lot of people seeing things very differently to the way those things are seen by other people.
Well, I would say that Pope Francis and our Prime Minister are of the same religion.
That's right. But again, I did see a headline just recently in one of our Australian newspapers saying Pope has turned to the left on climate change. I have nothing to do with writing encyclicals, but I am sure that he was not thinking of left or right politics when he put the encyclical together.
Someone also said that he should stick to religion rather than science, and it turns out he is a scientist. So,
Exactly. Any comment from Professor Levine on those issues?
Oh, I think what the Pope has been doing is just splendid. Even if we may disagree on the particulars of how we deal with ecological issues, we necessarily must deal with them because our future is at stake because of it. We have here issues of blowing the tops off mountains to get coal or whatever, and then to pollute the atmosphere even more. We're seeing species dying. The Bible tells us that God created the world and we are supposed to be stewards of it, and clearly we're messing up. If anybody is going to draw attention to this problem and get us actually to think about it, I think that's all to the good.
Right, a question then for Professor Mohammed. Does comparative religion get taught in your schools?
Does it get taught in any schools? I mean, in the Jewish or the Christian schools? I think if we're talking about schools as in the form of the madrasa, or the traditional schools that are often attached to mosques, you know, the after-hour school, the Sunday school type, then in most cases, no, it doesn't. If we're talking about Islamic schools, as in the case of the primary schools and state schools, government-run schools, and termed Islamic schools, then they have religious education like any other school has, and they indulge in visiting various churches and synagogues and so forth. So there's this exchange. It does take place. Does it take place to an extent that personally I see is satisfying? No, it doesn't. I think we need to do more of that, more of this comparative religion. But it has to be done with a certain code of ethics, if you wish. And I think it comes back also to the question before about engaging in interfaith dialogues. And I agree with the professor that we mustn't water down religions, and we must continue to agree and accept the fact that there are substantial differences. But it's how we engage in these comparative religious approaches or studies. And if you don't mind me saying that much has been written about this in classical Islamic tradition. They call it adab al-ikhtilaf, the ethics of disagreement. And so, for instance, that whilst you engage with the other, be he a Muslim or a non-Muslim, for instance, a primary teaching is that do not abuse their gods, otherwise they'll abuse yours. And that is based on a text. So that should make up a basic ethics in terms of engagement, that you don't There is disagreement, obviously, but that has to be taught in a way that is respectful and in a way that is not going to create and engender hate and discord between communities.
We might take another question live from our audience now.
Thank you. When you were talking about the situation of Muslim Spain with the Jewish and Christian minorities, and you used the term, referred to the term dhimmi. For a Jewish person, the history of being a dhimmi was not a position of any form of equality. It was somebody who existed at the whim of the ruler. You were weak, someone else was powerful. From the time of the Covenant of Omar, there have been times when rulers have been open to extending all sorts of possibilities to minorities, and other times where there has been oppression of minorities justified in the same way. And the missing term here in that discussion, to my ears anyway, was power. The power relationship was in no way equal. You had powerful and some less powerful or even powerless. When we came to the question of forgiveness, and there were questions from Professor Levine about genocide and forgiveness, you have situations where if the genocide is successful, there's no one left to forgive. And Professor Levine raised the question of a just war, the concept. And I would be very interested in hearing the responses from the other panellists to the idea of when, if ever, is violence legitimate in response to the use of power against the weak.
Would someone like to take up that question?
Power against the weak. Was that what?
One is just war.
Is that what you meant to say? Power against the weak?
When people are using power, there's use of power and there's people with no ability to protect themselves. When people are using power and the others have no ability to do anything about it except the possibility of somebody else using force on their behalf.
It's an imponderable. I'm a student of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had to contemplate the power that he had to actually help in ridding Germany of a tyrant, and the agony that he went through. And in the end, he felt that he couldn't walk away. He couldn't do the cheap grace thing and just walk away. So, yeah, is there some room for the thing we like to call just war? I guess we've got to leave it open at the, I would think, at the very margins. Thomas Aquinas, of course, has a lot to say about this. But I do think the notion of just war has been randomly used across our three traditions in quite unjustified ways. Theologically, pragmatically, how often does it work? How often does it make anything better? How often does it make things worse? You know, I mean, these are the imponderables that people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and George W. Bush, I guess, had to cogitate. In one case, I can aspire to the conclusion, and in another case, one can only see the disaster. So it's something I think we have to be hugely careful of. And in terms of the dhimmi, yeah, I did make reference to the fact that there are different views, and a lot of that's to do with the fact that convivencia happened across almost a millennium and in a lot of different places under different rulers and with different mixes of population. And certainly at times there were Jews and Christians who were right at the short end of the stick, but there were also a lot of Muslims who were at the short end of the stick because the particular caliph didn't, aspire to their form of Islam. So, as I said, where humanity is concerned, nothing's going to be perfect. But my heavens, I think if we could take the Middle East back now to the convivencia situation, I think we'd be a lot better off than we are.
Professor Lee.
I mean, I'm certainly for reconciliation where possible, but I'm also for protecting the weak. And therefore, I think protecting the weak sometimes calls on us to take up arms. I would not say that lightly. I think it's an absolute last resort. I'm aware that in a world of nuclear weapons, it's a much bigger thing to say than maybe even a few years ago. Nonetheless, I think that when the weak are under attack and are being annihilated by the powerful, and we have the means to stop them, then we should do so.
That question, by the way, I guess had a bit of resonance with one of our external questioners who said, is it ever justifiable within the context of the Gospel's spirit to utilise the sword in the modern warfare, such as bombs and missiles? What sorts of conflicts would justify such a usage? So I suppose we've sort of addressed part of that with what we've talked about in that particular question. Yeah.
Can I just also add, perhaps from Islamic perspective, there is of course the idea of a just war. And Averroes or Ibn Rushd, the great Spanish theologian, spoke about that, and of course influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas' idea of a just war. And this is where the concept of jihad comes in, obviously, where there is an aspect of jihad to do with military confrontation when there is a need for it. And just war does not mean a war of Muslims against other Muslims, non-Muslims, but it could also mean Muslims fighting other Muslims to protect an oppressed group who happen to be non-Muslims. And I think we cannot deny the fact that unfortunately war is sometimes an evil necessity, but it has to be governed with very strict ethics and guidelines, which do not necessarily, are not always followed. But again, from a Islamic or Sharia perspective, whilst a confrontational type of war is permitted under certain circumstances, it should be seen as the exception and not the norm. And if that exception is to be undertaken, it should be governed within certain ethics and guidelines and protocols and so forth. And yes, it is true that Jewish and Christian minority communities who were seen as dhimmi status under various Islamic rules sometimes were treated depending on the powers to be. And that's why it is important when we think about political leadership, particularly say in the Middle Eastern context, that we must not think of leadership, we must not focus leadership in individuals. We must not give power to an individual. We must think of institutions and infrastructures that can protect minority communities. And I think it is the onus on the Muslim community to examine the text and reinterpret the text perhaps within the realities of the day, and to think of infrastructures and institutions that can protect minority communities without giving them that status of dhimmi that seemed to be, or that operated in certain instances and were problematic.
We are just about out of time, but a quote from one of our viewers, Sue S., who says, brilliant address to Terry Lovett. It brought to mind a quote from the founder of my Christian denomination, Mary Baker Eddy. The quote, God is universal, confined to no spot, divine by no dogma, appropriated by no sect. I guess we could go on for many hours discussing aspects of that particular quote. But in the meantime, I would like to thank all of our participants today, Professor Terry Lovett, that I mentioned just a moment ago, also Reverend Dorothy Lee, and of course Imam Muhammad Abdallah, plus the professor online from the United States from time to time, Professor Amy Jill Levine. Thank you all very much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.